Hello, this is Sound Has No Cell. Today we want to reflect on a few African proverbs by the Yoruba that relate to the king. What do the Yoruba say about a king, about the head of the traditional institution in any town? The Yoruba would say, Ade ori la fi moba. A king is known by his crown. And they may take it further to say, Ade ori la fi moba, ilẹ̀kẹ̀ ni tàwọn ìjòyè. A king is known by his crown, while the chiefs, his chiefs, are known, identified by their beads. Which means that the moment you see a king, it should be easy to recognize him without any further introduction. The king would also wear beads, but the chiefs would not wear a crown. The crown belongs to the king and the king alone. And then the Yoruba would also say, Igba ile oba, oba ni ṣe. Àwo ilé ọba, ọba ní ṣe. Kódà ajá ilé ọba, ọba ni. That is, everything at the palace or everything belonging to a king is also royal. A king's shoes are royal. A king's cutlery are royal. The Yoruba would say, and here I will cite the example of a town in Ekiti. When they eulogize the king in their language, they will say, Onijuku, Onide Ijiye. That is, the king is the one called death, and he is also the one called life. They would say, Oko Eyelori, the husband of the queen. And when they say Olori, well, it simply means the wife of the king. But when they say Eyelori, they are making it clear to you that the office of the Olori is also a portfolio. Particularly where you hear titles like Eyeshorun, Eyelua. These are titles of for wives of kings in some domains. And where you hear Eye this, when they don't just say Olori, that Olori is also having his own office, our own office. The Olori is also having our own office. It's also a powerful portfolio. So the king is husband of the Eyelori and the son of the Eyelori. And that is why they say Aponle osi foba ti ololori, because the office of the Olori in the life of a king is so significant that we can't finish a discourse on it in a hurry. The Yoruba would say, Aki renu ojiji momo. You don't see a king eating about everywhere. The kings eat, but they don't eat. They don't just grab puff and popcorn on the road, and they don't just go to the table at parties with other people to eat anything openly. The same way, they don't just open their mouth to talk. They don't engage in cheap jokes and pedestrian interaction openly. They don't. The Yoruba would say, "Àìtọ́ba jẹ là ń jẹ́ ọba dípẹ̀, ọba máa ń pàṣẹ ni." It is a king that is not worth his salt that pleads. A king issues commands. Authority derives from the king. A king commands. A king speaks with authority. Ọba aláṣẹ, a king, the custodian of authority, of power. And they would say that a king's authority is absolute. A king's word is law. A king's presence is the presence of his authority. Wherever you see a king, his authority is also present there. Having said that, a king as the number one citizen of his domain is father to all, and because he's father to all, a king is also gracious. A king is loving. A king is a man of very high self-esteem. But he loves his people and protects them and defends them, but he doesn't stoop so low to get engaged in certain things. A king is a king. A king is respectable and should be respectable everywhere, anywhere, by anyone. In some communities, they don't allow the king's mother or father to live. And in some communities where the king's father or the king's mother is allowed to live, you won't see the king's father at the palace anytime. The king's mother would go to see her son, the king, very early in the morning in the king's closest chambers, so that she will not talk to the king as my son, my little son, in the presence of everybody. She's still there to counsel, to advise, to defend, to protect, to pray, to nurture the king. But this will now be very private. She won't do that. She won't just call out to her son, who is a king, openly, the way she used to call him before he became king. A king, ọba kì í ṣe ẹni àrífín. But having said that, nobody can insult a king if the king doesn't permit it, if the king doesn't allow it, if the king doesn't call for it, if the king doesn't open the door for that. Nobody. There's so much to say. I want us to be careful the way it is said. But a king is the number one custodian of the culture, the tradition, the values, the norms of his people. And when a king begins to betray his own foundation, the foundation gets weaker. And when if you are standing on a foundation and you are by yourself grating it away, the foundation is getting weaker, then you can fill in the gap. So it is for the king to respect the stool. If the king doesn't respect the stool, who will? The king has to respect his stool, respect himself, and others will then respect the king and his stool. The Yoruba would say, bí èèyàn bá pe igbá rẹ̀ ní ìkólẹ̀, ọmọ aráyé á bá da ìdọ̀tí sí. Ní Èkìtì, wọ́n á ní béèyàn bá pe igbá rẹ̀ ní àkíkàràgbá. Àwọn elédè Yorùbá á máa pè ní àǹkàrà. Ní téèyàn bá pe igbá rẹ̀, bó ní bá ṣe pe igbá rẹ̀ la ṣe ń bá a pè. It is what you call your calabash that others would call it. If you call it an ornament, yes, it is an ornament. If you call it a basin, it is a basin. If you call it a canister, it is a canister. If you call it a container, it is a container. If you call it a waste paper basket, that's what it is. If you call it dustbin, that is what it is. So whatever you call your calabash is what others call it. That's it on Sound Has No Cell. I'll see you again and very soon. Bye for now.